Welcome to today's episode of TheSquare. I'm really excited to be here with Tania and Sam. You guys are two of my favorite people at Corgan, and this is our third Curiosity Report Launch Square podcast. That's kind of a mouthful. Tell me a little bit about what has changed over the last 3 years with the Curiosity Report.
Well, a lot has changed this year as compared to the last 2 years. The last 2 years we had a much longer report, which was probably about 150 pages, 250 pages, maybe almost 300 pages. I mean, they were pretty big reports. And a lot of that was because what we used to do was source material across Corganites, get ideas from a lot of different Corganites, and see where they were interested in the research topic that we had proposed. This year, because of the topic that we had picked, we wanted to make sure that we were talking to experts across the industry. And so we kept the articles shorter. They're a lot more bite-sized, but we also
More
included
pictures for people like me.
more pictures for you,
Yes, exactly.
people that don't read. And then we also, for every article, have an expert opinion or voice to help support the data that we've been gathering. So it really helps to solidify the concept.
Because it's technical. Some of the stuff's pretty technical.
So are you bringing in more outside opinions than in the first couple of years?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
Every single article that we have has at least one, if not more, experts on it.
How have you seen that change the content?
I definitely think that there's a much more application directly to the work that we do here at Corgan. And I also think that it's helpful for us because a lot of the concepts that we have been building in each of the articles can be, theorized, but then can also be supported by the secondary research and then supported by expert opinions and what they're actually doing out in the field.
And maybe potentially have an easier on-ramp to practical applications.
Right.
And some of the topics that we covered in 2020 and 2021 were more sweeping, more abstract topics, but you're seeing them now. It's like we've kind of spent a couple years learning about things like mixed realities and and you're kind of seeing its application in a more technical, more focused topic.
So the first year really focused on dark technologies, and then last year I loved, which was perspectives and understanding bias. And this year it's energy. Why energy?
Yeah, so this topic actually came to us pretty easy because we were seeing a lot across the industry, across our research, that was focused on new ways to provide or generate energy on site. We have had a sweeping discussion across the U.S. and across the world about mental health and mental energy, especially in the workplace. And so we really thought that this was a good opportunity to take something where we could look at emerging technologies in our industry and then also look at different perspectives in our energy and combine them.
Right.
Kind of like how our first Curiosity Report was all about emerging technologies, how our second one was all about perspectives.
Yeah.
It feels like every time I look, there's somebody talking about some aspect of energy. I mean, the Super Bowl was just a couple weeks ago, and I saw literally, of all the car commercials, there was one gas car commercial, and all the rest were electric vehicles.
Oh, that's funny. I don't even remember the gas
It was
one.
crazy.
There's definitely like a tipping point that I think everyone now realizes we're at, and everything boils down to energy. I mean, even an electric vehicle it's great. It's better than combustion, but if the energy that you're plugging into that car is coming from a coal plant, it's like you have to decarbonize. You have to totally go upstream to the source. I think something else that we thought was kind of funny with this topic was, with dark, I mean, that was pretty futuristic. We're talking about quantum computing, and something about this topic almost feels like outdated. Like we should have been, we're a little late to the game.
Yeah.
We really should, we're like in hyperdrive right now.
Do you find that happens when you're, especially in the fields that you're in and the data research that you do, you're, reading through an article about, this up and coming trend, and you're like, that's something we already know everything about.
We do, when it comes to like everybody talking about the metaverse right now, it's really funny because we talked a lot about a lot of things happening in the metaverse in our 2020 Curiosity Report. And so that was one topic that we had on the table to put into this edition, because there's there's actually a really interesting parallel between like what the metaverse can provide versus the data consumption needed and the energy to, you know, support all of that data capacity. And there's a really interesting, and then the environmental impact as well. But we did feel like, you know, that was the topic that we covered heavily in the 2020 Curiosity Report, and we didn't want to revisit.
Okay, so are there topics that you feel like in the first 2 years just didn't go where you felt like they were going to go, or they didn't achieve what you were hoping they would achieve?
Probably the dark technologies, the quantum piece, because it's so fringe. Like it's still like questionable. Like there's, if you read about it, you know that like major companies are spending a lot of money and time, but it still feels like science fiction.
It's like there's a path to get there, but nobody's still figured out exactly what that path is yet.
One thing I did love about this year's Curiosity Report is when we were talking to a concrete scientist who is actually the CEO of AI, Concrete AI. He's talking about how they're using AI and machine learning to reduce the carbon content in cement, which is a major portion of concrete. And he was actually linking to quantum computing and talking about how when we can integrate quantum computing into the machine learning process for this, for, you know, developing the AI for the cement, that we will actually have a much better process for reducing carbon across the world in our concrete
and that's a great point too, because a lot of the conversation with energy is also rooted in material science and identifying new combinations of elements that can create new materials for like batteries especially. So there's like that huge supercomputer up in Berkeley that once it can go quantum, I mean, it can already make so many computations like rapid speed, but once it can go quantum, then it's like you could develop much better, more sustainable batteries, which is really also an environmental. So
to that point, impact. Do you know, when you're so focused on future looking technologies, is looking back to things like, because I remember when we were talking to Brent about concrete, like looking back to the way things have always been done and kind of re-examining if that's actually the way that they should continue to be done. Is it just as important to kind of look behind you as it is in front of you?
I think, well, first of all, building context always helps. So you can't really understand where to go unless you know where you're coming from. But I also think that when we're looking back and revisiting how we do things, I think that's super important. And also taking, from our perspectives, Curiosity Report, taking an outside point of view and listening to people that may not be in that specific industry, but maybe in a parallel industry or a completely different industry, and seeing how they would do it differently actually can help us move forward. So I do think looking back can help, but I do think looking forward helps as well.
Well, as I was reading through the Curiosity Report for this year, and obviously mostly just looking at the pictures, one of the themes that I saw that carried over was this idea of decentralization and democratization, particularly when it comes to energy. Tell me a little bit more about that.
There's a lot.
There's a lot, yeah. I mean, when we are talking about democratization of energy, one of the concepts that we bring forward in this Curiosity Report is looking at, you know, what's happening to the grid. And instead of saying there's one grid and there's a utility service provider that we all kind of use, and especially since we're here in Texas and the grid is top of mind for all of us in February, right after an ice storm, we are looking instead of a grid of grids. Where there are actually multiple microgrids that could be possible within a city. And because we might even be looking at a building level microgrid instead of a microgrid that is at the grid level, then we can start to think about how those building microgrids can generate energy on site and then share that energy with another building or share it with other buildings in a community. So for example, if you can think of any big box store like a Walmart, a Target, an At Home, you know, any
an Amazon fulfillment store.
Maybe, yes. Then you can think about, well, what kind of energy can we produce on that site because those buildings are so massive, and then overproduce for that consumption, for that annual consumption, and then share that with the community so that the community is actually reducing their energy bills as well.
I know that
And
was
gain
one
the
thing.
efficiency.
And
That's
gain
probably
the
the biggest
efficiency.
thing we've learned is like there's so much energy wasted in just literally transporting it from generation to where it needs to go.
I know
That you can do it on
That was
site.
one thing that Hover really hit hard on.
Right.
Was being able to bring that so much closer to home.
Right, exactly. And that's the article that we are talking about, the grid of grids, is our article where we're talking about capturing the power that's all around us, which is talking about turbulent wind within our cities.
Well, and it really it checks two boxes, because it's not only reducing the waste of transferring energy, but it's also creating a more stable grid, because you're not dependent on one or two or a handful of feeds.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because if you think about it, there were a lot of homes in California that during the wildfires, even though they had solar on their rooftops, they still lost power.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were like, well, how? Because they're generating their own power. They don't have battery storage. So when
Which
you're
is a great transition. Let's talk a little bit about battery storage, because I know that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Well, when
that's a
you're
big one.
generating energy on site right now, and in a lot of places, because we don't have any way to support that energy or to store that energy for later use, we're reliant on the weather, which is a topic of conversation that used to be like pretty menial to people, and now it's very, very specific. But if we could start to store our energy that we're gathering during the day, or when the wind is blowing versus when it's not blowing, or even hydropower when it's raining and when it's not raining, if we can store that energy and use it for times later on in the week
And
whatever.
transport it, right? Because like you have a just like oil and gas, it's geolocated. So you have areas that are like more prone for solar, more prone for wind, but they don't need all of that wind capacity. So you have to find ways to trap it in some sort of high capacity battery, transport it. But then batteries are tricky. That's what we've also come across is like with building code right now, you can only have a certain amount of kilowatt hour load in it because they heat and they can cause fires and they're dangerous. So we now have to think like you're cramming all these EVs or like battery loads to trapped wind. Well, you need those to be safe too.
Do you feel like there's a shift from kind of the technology and the innovation focusing on energy creation, whether it's solar or wind or hydro or whatever, there's so much advancement in that area, to the storage? Has storage kind of was it a little bit forgotten, and now it's maybe going to get a little bit more innovation, or has it just always been a struggle?
I don't know if it's always been a struggle. I think it's definitely a missing link right now, right? You have like battery, for example, we have a piece in there called the V2X parking garage, where you have an electric vehicle that cannot just take power from the grid, it can offload some of its power. But
So
right
that's
now,
something we've got right here, right?
yeah, perfect. But right now, the car company has a warranty on that battery. They don't want you to use it 1,000 times to power your house. They
Right.
want to make sure that energy use is being used for the car. And so just something like that, because battery lives are not that long, we need a 2 million mile battery.
Right.
That's what and then they'd be like, I don't care, do it with your house,
Yeah.
offload it at the parking garage, do whatever, but right now it's limited.
Well, if you think about the way that PV panels, solar panels, have transitioned over the years, I mean, they used to be very expensive for little energy generation. And we have a project here at Corgan, Fort Bend Middle School, where when I was talking to one of the project managers on that project, he was mentioning that the capacity that they were able to generate, or the energy that they were able to generate, kept changing throughout the entire design process because the solar panels were getting more and more and more efficient. And so I think that, if you think about it, I mean, solar has been around for so many years as we've been putting this on our buildings. And now it's time to focus on batteries. And I think that same maturation will happen as we start to find different areas and different reasons that we need these batteries on site. And to the point about the V2X garage, one of the things that we're talking about there is capturing solar power, putting it into your battery, taking that power, creating a transmission line that doesn't really exist but doesn't need any extra infrastructure, which means the car itself is the transmission, and then bringing it to the parking garage or the building that the parking garage is attached to, or just different services that the parking garage provides, and turning that energy into currency.
And speaking of grids, the grids can get actually as small as even potentially a shoe.
Yep.
At this point, I know we did an interview with you a while back, talking about the design sprint that kind of came up with jolts, but with the idea that anybody from a child to an adult could be wearing these and using piezoelectric generation, generate electricity. And then, when you stick your feet under your desk, there's a mat that discharges a shoe, or, any number of things. So you can get the grid as small as that. What does that afford us? What benefits do we have when a grid is that small?
So one thing that we talk about in the book is the fact that different types of on-site energy generation are now at the building level, which is a microgrid at the building level, which has not been done in a large way before. When we're talking about jolts and this tennis shoe, we're thinking about microgrid.
Nano.
Yeah, and really democratizing
Trademark.
access to generating your own energy. Right now, when we think about a traditional family, maybe you're thinking a family of 4, a mom, a dad, and 2 kids, and you're thinking about how they generate their own energy. Well, they have to purchase a solar roof, and they have to go through all the steps. It's very expensive, sometimes too prohibitive, especially for different communities.
And if they don't have a south-facing roof, and just
exactly,
all the different
too
things.
many
Yeah,
trees.
you can have all the money in the world,
Yeah.
and your house just won't allow it.
Exactly. And so with jolts, what our brilliant interns came up with, I should mention that the jolts project was part of our summer intern design sprint that we do every summer. And what this team came up with was the idea that we could generate energy through a shoe with piezoelectricity running through the soles, and being able to store it within a battery that sits within the sole of the shoe. And what they found in their study was that for a family of 4, for typical walking distances and typical steps that people track. There's a lot of data out there, by the way, how many people track however many steps, that they would be able to cover the monthly energy consumption of a typical 4-person family.
I bet with my 3-year-old we could knock it out with just him.
Well, and that's the thing is, like, if you think about education systems, there are some schools where they're in communities that actually need more help, and what better way to donate these types of shoes through a shoe program like Tom's or something like that, where they donate these shoes. The students are able to play all day, to move around all day, to generate this type of electricity, store it, and at the end of the day, they take those batteries out and that energy goes back to the school. Maybe that could help reduce, be a tax incentive. Maybe that could help, different communities across the U.S. that are maybe in lower economic situations.
So tell me a little bit about some of the other trends that you guys examined. I saw Zero to be a Hero. Tell me a little bit about that one.
I like that name, and I don't think my team got it, but it's
you've got
Hercules.
this. We'll insert the Hercules clip here. But with this idea of the difference between being kind of on paper net zero and being real net zero.
Right. Yeah, this is a concept that we learned by talking to some of our experts, where they were telling us that, our goals for 2050 are to be net zero. And they were like, that's great, but that's not where we need to be. And in fact, one of the books that we reference in the Curiosity Report, called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, even talks about the difference between net zero and real zero, and what it's going to take to get to real zero. And so the idea is that with net zero, you can offload, or you can buy a forest somewhere and get those credits, but still you're putting those emissions into the air. With real zero, we're reducing the emissions.
You're not just supplementing what you're putting in. You're actually giving it a negative.
Because those gases stay in the air. And
Right.
so we need to get to a place where we can function without creating emissions.
Right. And something that we also talk about in that article is the difference between carbon emissions and operational emissions. Because there's one thing that we as architects know. I think Frank Lloyd Wright, the reason why he designed the buildings he did, where you can't move the furniture around is because he knew that as soon as people come and live in those houses, that they're going to change it and it's going to wreck his design. And so I think when we as architects are designing buildings, we design them to be as efficient as possible, or as efficient as technology will allow, or even sometimes as efficient as our clients will let us move in that direction. And that's all well and great. But if we design a very efficient building that then is so complex to operate that people start making affordances here and start taking, liberties here on how they operate the building, then it reduces the efficiencies that we put into place, and in some cases can make it even more inefficient. So we have to talk about, ways to reduce emissions, but we also have to talk about the behavioral aspect of people within the building and how they're operating and using the building day to day in order to really understand the holistic journey of the building. And then to Tania's point, looking at embodied carbon in everything that we do, from just designing the building and the energy that goes into our programs to design the building.
You literally the lights that are kept on while you're,
to the furniture that we put in the building, the embodied carbon that comes with that.
What other trends really excited you this year?
Oh, I don't know. Lots of them.
One of the things that we found, and we put this in the Curiosity Report, it's a very short segment, but we've been very interested in how electric vehicles are starting to play a role in architecture. For years we've been talking about how electric vehicles, how are they going to change architecture?
Yeah.
We've had these grand concepts for years, and now it's getting to the point where there's so much user adoption that we can start to see real scenarios playing out. And one of those,
it goes beyond the 2 token charge points at the front of the parking lot.
We're like, oh, you get a gold star.
One of this small article, very small, it's like half a page. We talk
so
about
it's my speed.
It's your speed, and there's a big image to go with it. But we highlight a company called Rivian, who has been talking with GM and a couple of other Ford and others on manufacturing and their product. But one thing that's great about it is not only did Amazon start purchasing Rivian trucks so that they can deliver more efficiently, which leads to another trend that I'm very interested in. But the other thing is this truck itself is so human-centered design. I mean, there's so many little things that they really thought about.
You put your skis in the back. You can pop out a picnic table.
A lot of skiing in Dallas.
But I mean, a week ago.
No, that's true. It's a good point. No, I it was funny. For all the different car manufacturers out there, it was so markedly different how human-centric their designs were.
Right.
It really caught you by surprise, or at least it did me.
Right. I think as designers, it's really nice to see the thought and effort put into something like that, especially the fact that we do qualitative research where we reach out to users and get their perspectives, and they did the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But the reason they bought that they're building a fleet is to support companies like Amazon, who are also like, they take up such a huge market share that they're like, they know they have a responsibility. And so we spent a lot of time, actually the last year or so, we've been looking at fulfillment and the retail experience and how it's been changing, but like a lot of things with COVID, it kind of accelerated this trend of buying things online. And now you're seeing things like ghost stores or dark stores, that they have different names, where the front end retail experience is really where you go to see the brand or see the thing, and then it's getting flown to your house in an hour, and you're not lugging it around. And that's just been a pretty interesting, that's a paradigm shift in like how people shop.
Right.
But what I have found most interesting is looking at the fulfillment center as a workplace, right? There's been a lot of press around the conditions in warehouses, and we're trying to move on up in human history, right? Not go back. And so you're seeing these warehouses that have basketball courts and cafes, and there's a theme for co-warehousing. So if I make candles on my off time at home as my little side business, I can't afford to buy my own warehouse.
Right.
It's the overhead and everything. So just like a WeWork, but for a co-warehouse, I pay a monthly fee and I get access to like a photography room where I can photograph my products. And then I get access to the fulfillment machinery and services. So like during peak demand, like holidays, I get access to fulfillment staff who can help me package up and send out. And that's like
awesome.
Distribution and democratization of these things that like 5 years ago, Amazon and Walmart had kind of only access to that.
On,
Right.
And, you know, you're just seeing that kind of open up. And then one other thing that we learned with just logistics in general and shipping things is that last mile from like when it leaves the warehouse and kind of goes to the urban core is also the most energy intensive portion. So if you can start to reduce that by having like drop-off centers or like, and we already have that, right? But like if it just gets better, you're going to also reduce energy use.
Right.
So an incredible 3 years. What do you think the next 3 years brings? Both in technology, but also just with the Curiosity Report.
Well, I think, you know, we've already started talking about topics for next year's Curiosity Report, of course. It's funny how once we finish one, we see a lot of things that are relating to the one that we just launched. And then we also see things that are just like, okay, that needs to go in the next one. So, you know, I don't know what the next 3 years brings. I could say something, but I am afraid of Cassandra syndrome. So. But what I will say is, you know, in the next few years, what we are expecting out of the Curiosity Report is to continue these conversations with experts. I mean, I feel like, you know, we learned so much from the professors that we spoke to at Stanford University that helped us understand energy innovation, to the concrete scientists and those that are innovating across that industry, to those in the food industry and the vertical farming industry and the distribution that we talked to you about them with food. And how that whole logistics is, whole area is changing. And so I do feel like that was one thing that we took from this Curiosity Report that will completely transform the next few coming up.
Well, certainly some of the topics from this year's Curiosity Report, we've gotten a chance to talk to some of the people, whether it was vertical farming or Brent and the concrete, going all in on concrete. And so if you want to check out some of those a little bit more in depth, we'll put the links below, as well as the link to your digital copy of this year's Curiosity Report. Thank you all so much for being here. I can't wait to see you next year when we talk about a whole new batch of cutting edge trends. And thank you so much for watching or listening, and make sure to join us next time.